There are voices that are not only heard, but trusted. When Julie Andrews sings in The Sound of Music, it is not simply music. It is a feeling that is almost perfect, clear, and so pure that doubt disappears. And then, in Mary Poppins, that voice does something else. Not just telling a story, but creating an entire world where everything seems to be in its proper place, where emotion is held at just the right rhythm, where beauty exists without effort. For a long time, the world did not just admire Julie Andrews. They believed in her, believed that voice was something that could not change, could not fade, could not be touched by time, a symbol of perfection, a standard that almost no one could reach, and that no one imagined would disappear. But there was something almost no one ever asked, at least not at that time. Not when everything was still intact, not when that voice still existed as something unquestioned. What would happen if one day the very thing that defined that person disappeared? Not weakened, not gradually changed, but disappeared completely. And if that happened, who would Julie Andrews be? Or deeper still, can an artist continue to exist when the very thing the world recognizes them by is no longer there? Julie Andrews was born on October 1st, 1935, in Walton-on-Thames, England. Her real name was Julia Elizabeth Wells, a very ordinary name in circumstances that were far from ordinary. Her father was a teacher of metalwork and woodworking. Her mother, Barbara, was a performer who played piano and sang. When Julie was very young, her parents divorced, and from that point on, her childhood began to be divided, not only in terms of family, but also in her sense of security. Her mother remarried Ted Andrews, a stage performer. It was he who brought Julie into the world of performance. But it was not the warm environment people often imagine. The new family lived under unstable financial conditions. And in many accounts later in life, Julie Andrews admitted that her childhood was not truly happy. During the years of World War II, Britain was under constant bombing. Children were evacuated from cities. Julie was also sent away from London to avoid the air raids. But the constant movement, living away from family, then returning again, left her childhood without a sense of stability. And then, in the midst of all that, the voice appeared. Not as an accidental discovery, but almost as something astonishing. When Julie was very young, it was noticed that she could sing notes most adults could not reach. A rare range, pure, powerful, and extremely precise. Ted Andrews began training her, not gently, but with discipline, repetition, rigorous practice, like the making of a stage performer, not a child at play. Julie began performing at around the age of 10 to 12. Small stages, performances for soldiers, audiences who did not come for art, but to forget the war, so even if only for a few minutes. A child, standing before them, not trembling, not failing, not allowed to fail. And gradually, that became normal. The voice was no longer something special to her. It became responsibility, a job, a way for the family to earn a living, a way to prove that she had value. Some children discover passion. Julie Andrews discovered her role. Not because she chose it, but because circumstances placed it in her hands. And perhaps that is what created something very different. Julie Andrews' voice was not built only on talent. It was built on discipline, on pressure, and on a childhood where standing firm was not a choice, but a necessity. After years of performing from childhood, Julie Andrews did not stop. She did not leave the stage. She grew up on the stage. In England, she gradually became a phenomenon. Not in a loud way, no scandal, no attention drawn by a strong personality, but through something else, an almost absolute precision. A voice that never missed a note, a presence controlled down to every detail. At a time when the stage was still the place where true ability was tested. Julie Andrews stood out not because she tried to be different, but because she was almost incapable of being wrong. But the real turning point came when she left England and stepped into a larger world, Broadway. In 1956, she was cast as Eliza Doolittle in the musical My Fair Lady, a role that demanded transformation from a poor flower girl with a heavy local accent into an elegant lady. Julie Andrews did not just sing the role, she lived it. Her voice, her pronunciation, every small movement, all were controlled. Not to impress, but to convince. And Broadway believed. That role made her one of the most sought-after stage stars of the time. Not long after, she continued with the role of Guinevere in Camelot, a completely different figure, yet still carrying something familiar, refinement, precision, and a sense of near unbreakable control. At this point, Julie Andrews was no longer a promising talent. She was a standard, but right at that peak, a paradox began to appear. When Hollywood decided to adapt My Fair Lady into a film, the role that had made her name was no longer hers. Instead, they chose another name, a film star, a face considered more suitable for the big screen. Julie Andrews, the one who had defined that role on stage, was removed from her own story. Not because she was not good enough, but because she was not yet a film star. It was a very strange moment. A person who had reached the peak of the stage, yet was still not enough to enter the world of cinema. A great success that opened up a void. And perhaps it was that very void that prepared something else. Not repetition, but a greater leap. An opportunity. Coming from a completely different place, there are moments in a career that do not feel like a step forward. They feel like a shift in state. And for Julie Andrews, that moment began very quietly, right after a rejection. When Hollywood decided not to cast her in the film version of My Fair Lady, it was not a public failure, but it was a gap. A question, an invisible boundary between stage and screen, where talent alone was not enough. And then, almost immediately, another opportunity appeared. Not loud, not promoted as a comeback, simply a role, but one unlike any other. Mary Poppins, a character who could fly, step into imagined worlds, turn ordinary things into something magical, without explanation. A figure suspended between reality and unreality, where any attempt to act too much could make it feel artificial. But Julie Andrews did not try to do that. She did not try to make Mary Poppins more relatable. She did not add extra emotion. She did not pull the character down into everyday life. On the contrary, she kept everything at a very precise distance, just enough for the audience to believe, but not enough to break the illusion. Her voice remained the same, pure, clear, not a single wrong note. Her gaze was calm, her gestures controlled. Everything was placed exactly where it belonged and stopped exactly when it should. No display, no effort to impress. Only one thing, absolute precision. And that made the character feel real. not because it resembled real life, but because it did not contradict the world it belonged to. The audience did not analyze this. They simply felt it. And they believed. They believed in Mary Poppins. And from that, they believed in Julie Andrews. The film became a phenomenon, not just because of the story, but because of a feeling that is difficult to name. The sense that everything was happening exactly as it should. Nothing misplaced, nothing excessive, nothing missing. And then, almost immediately, recognition came. The Academy Award for Best Actress in her very first film role. Not after years of accumulation, not after multiple attempts, just once, and it was enough. But what mattered was not the award. At that time, Hollywood did not just see an actress who could sing, act, and maintain perfect rhythm. They saw an image that could be trusted, a standard that could be repeated, a presence the audience was willing to accept without question. And from that moment on, Julie Andrews was no longer simply an artist moving from stage to screen. She became an icon, an image of perfection, a feeling of control, something almost impossible to get wrong. After Mary Poppins, Julie Andrews had everything a film star could need. But what followed was not just success, it was a definition. The Sound of Music did not begin as a guaranteed blockbuster. In fact, at the time, Hollywood was gradually moving away from musicals. Many believed the genre had passed its peak, but the film chose to go in the opposite direction. A simple story, a clear historical setting. Austria before its annexation by Nazi Germany. A family, a woman who enters and changes everything through music. Julie Andrews played Maria, a novice nun who has not completed her vows, sent to care for 7 children in the Von Trapp family. This is not a powerful character, not someone in control from the beginning. Maria is awkward, uncertain, even somewhat out of place. And that is what made the role different. Julie Andrews no longer stood in the position of untouchable perfection, as in Mary Poppins. She allowed space within the character, allowed clumsiness to exist, allowed emotion to appear naturally. But when Maria begins to sing, everything changes. Do Re Mi is not just a song about teaching music. It is a way for one person to connect with children. Edelweiss is not just a melody. It becomes a symbol of a country about to disappear. And the opening scene, when Maria spins across the hills, is not just a beautiful image. It is a statement, a voice, large enough to fill the space, yet gentle enough not to break its peace. The film succeeded far beyond expectations. It became one of the highest-grossing works of its time. It won multiple Academy Awards, including Best Picture. But more importantly, it did not stop at the cinema. It was shown again, sung again, passed from one generation to another. And at the center of it all was still that voice. Not the most complex voice, not the most powerful voice, but the one people recognize instantly, without needing explanation. From that point on, Julie Andrews was no longer just someone performing a character. She became part of how the world remembers the film. And the film became part of how the world remembers her. It is a very rare relationship. Not the actor creating the work, not the work creating the actor, but both merging into one. And from that moment, Julie Andrews' voice no longer belonged only to her. It became a shared memory, an invisible standard, a sound that, when heard, people do not just listen, they remember. After becoming a global icon with the sound of music, Julie Andrews entered a very particular phase, where success was no longer the goal, but a limit that needed to be surpassed. And at the center of that shift was Blake Edwards. They met in the late 1960s, at a time when both were standing at different crossroads. Julie Andrews was an almost impossible-to-get-wrong icon in the eyes of the public. Meanwhile, Blake Edwards, a director known for sharp, sometimes satirical humor, was someone who did not believe in absolute perfection. They married in 1969, but their relationship was not only a marriage, it was a deeply creative partnership, a balance between two nearly opposite worlds. Julie Andrews represented discipline, control, precision. Blake Edwards represented disruption, irony, and imperfect perspectives, and that contrast created space for change. Blake Edwards saw something many others did not, that Julie Andrews was not just a voice. She possessed a far more complex acting ability than the image Hollywood had assigned to her. He did not try to keep her within the old mold. He rewrote it. In the projects they worked on together, he placed her in situations that were no longer safe. Characters with internal contradictions. Stories that were no longer simply divided between right and wrong. The peak of that collaboration was Victor/Victoria. This was not just a film, it was a statement, a role where Julie Andrews had to completely break her perfect image, not by opposing it, but by turning it into part of the game. A woman pretending to be a man, who then pretends to be another woman. A layered structure, a role that required control, but in an entirely different way. And Blake Edwards was behind it, not only as a director, but as someone who understood the limits of his wife and knew how to push them further. Their relationship was not always easy. Blake Edwards was known to have a complex, sometimes dark personality. His career also went through many ups and downs, and those things affected their personal life as well. But they stayed together, not because of stability, but because of understanding. Julie Andrews once said that Blake Edwards was the one who helped her see other parts of herself, parts she had never had the chance to express. And perhaps that is the most important thing. Not someone who helps you become more successful, but someone who helps you become more than you ever thought you were. In a world that had defined Julie Andrews by perfection, Blake Edwards was the first person who allowed her to be imperfect. And from that point on, she was no longer just an icon preserved unchanged. She became an artist, capable of change. There are losses that do not happen gradually. They arrive in a single moment and change everything. In 1997, Julie Andrews underwent vocal cord surgery. At first, it was not considered anything unusual. Her voice had begun to show signs of fatigue after years of continuous work, especially on stage. Doctors believed that intervention would help improve the condition. A technical decision, a seemingly simple solution. But the result was not that. The surgery did not succeed as expected. Damage occurred. And almost immediately, the clearest reality appeared. The voice had changed. No longer as before. No longer controllable. No longer carrying the precision that had once been the foundation of everything. Not weakened, but unable to return. For an ordinary person, that might be a major loss. But for Julie Andrews, it was a rupture. Because the voice was not just a tool, it was identity. It was what the world recognized her by. What she had built since childhood, standing on stage during wartime. What all her later success revolved around. And now, it was no longer the same. What is striking is, her fame did not disappear. The audience still loved her. The films were still there. The image remained. There was no scandal, no public collapse. Everything on the outside remained intact. But inside, everything had changed. An artist defined by her voice could no longer use it. There was no way to train back to the old point. No clear path forward, only a silence. And within that silence, a question began to emerge. If you lose the thing that has defined you your entire life, who are you? It was not a loud tragedy, not a collapse the world could see. It was quieter than that, but deeper. Because for the first time, Julie Andrews had to face a very simple reality, and a very difficult one to accept. That the thing that made her who she was might no longer be there. After the surgery in 1997, everything did not end, but it could not return to what it was before. Julie Andrews did not disappear from the public. She did not completely withdraw, but her presence changed. No longer the singing voice, no longer the thing that had defined her for decades. And in that silence, the first thing she did was not to try to reclaim what had been lost, but to accept that it would not return. Not an easy acceptance, but a necessary one. From there, she began to find other ways to continue existing as an artist. No longer singing, but still using her voice. No longer performing, but still telling stories. Julie Andrews moved into voice acting, a form where the voice does not need to be perfect in the musical sense, but still requires rhythm, emotion, and control. No more high notes, no more technical display, only the way a person conveys what they want to say. Alongside that, she began to write children's books, simple stories, yet built with the refinement she had carried throughout her life. No longer a stage, no longer a live audience, but still, there were people listening in a different way. And then, she returned to the screen. The Princess Diaries, no longer the girl singing across the hills, no longer the almost unreal image of perfection. This time, she appeared as a woman who had moved through time, calm, controlled, but no longer distant. No need to prove anything. No need to reach any standard. Only to be present. And what is remarkable is, the audience still accepted her. Not because she retained what she once had, but because she remained herself in another way. No longer the singing voice, but still the presence. No longer the old perfection, but still the depth. And perhaps that is the most important transformation. Julie Andrews was no longer an artist defined by her ability. She became an artist defined by how she continues when that ability is no longer there. From a voice, she became a storyteller. Without music, without a stage, with only one thing, that she still had something to share. There are artists remembered for technique. There are others remembered for emotion. Julie Andrews is not the most technically complex voice in history, not the one with the greatest technical mastery by academic standards. And over time, she even lost the very instrument that made her name. But that did not diminish her place. Because Julie Andrews' legacy does not lie in how well she sings. It lies in what the world feels when she sings. When the music rises in the sound of music, people do not just hear a song. They feel freedom, a rare lightness, a sense that everything can become better. In Mary Poppins, that voice does not just guide the story. It creates belief, the belief that magic can exist if we allow ourselves to believe in it. That is not technique. That is connection. A kind of connection that needs no explanation, no analysis, only experience. And because of that, when the voice is no longer there, the feeling it created remains. People still remember, not the individual notes, but how they once felt when they heard it. That is a very particular kind of legacy. It does not depend on whether the artist continues to perform. It does not depend on whether they can repeat what they once did. It exists in the memory of others. And perhaps that is why Julie Andrews still remains, even when she no longer sings. Not as a voice, but as a feeling. A standard that does not need to be maintained, because it has already been remembered. Something that does not need to be heard again, because it already lives in the memory of generations. And at that point, Julie Andrews' voice is no longer limited by sound. It moves beyond it. No longer something you hear, but something you remember. There are lives that, when looked back on, appear as a very clear, straight line, beginning from a very small point and gradually rising until reaching a peak. But when looked at more closely, one realizes the most important part does not lie in the starting point, nor in that peak. It lies in what happens afterward. Julie Andrews began as a girl in wartime, without a strong foundation, without a guaranteed future, only a voice and circumstances that forced her to use it as a way to stand firm. From small stages serving soldiers, she stepped onto larger stages. Then from there, into Broadway. And then Hollywood. Step by step, not rushed, not loud, but steady enough to eventually become an icon recognized by the entire world. A journey that seemed complete, an image that seemed unchangeable. But at the very point that seemed most stable, everything was tested. Not by public failure, not by a collapse that everyone could see, but by a very personal loss. Very quiet. The voice, the thing that had opened every door, was also the thing that no longer remained. And from that moment on, the story was no longer about what she had achieved. It became a simpler question, but far more difficult. When you lose the thing that has defined you your entire life, who are you? Julie Andrews did not answer that question by returning to the past. She did not try to become her former self. She did not attempt to repeat what had once worked. She changed, not loudly, not with declaration, without needing to prove anything to anyone. Just a slow but clear shift from a voice to a storyteller, from an icon of perfection to a human being who could continue to exist, even when that perfection was no longer there. And perhaps that is what truly defines her. Not the notes she once sang, not the roles that made her name, but the way she continued when all of those things were no longer intact. An artist endures, not because they preserve their original talent, but because they know how to become a different version of themselves when what once defined them is gone. There are people who are remembered for what they did, and there are also those who are remembered for what they overcame. Julie Andrews was once a voice the world believed could not be wrong. She also became an icon, an image of perfection, of discipline, of a world where everything seemed to be in its proper place. But after everything, what remains is not only what she once achieved, it is how she continued when she could no longer be that person, a voice, an icon, and in the end, a human being who transcended her own definition, without needing to hold on to the past, without needing to repeat what has already passed, only to continue in another way. And perhaps that is what makes this story never truly end. It simply slows down and continues to exist in a quieter way. If you are drawn to the quiet truth behind legendary names, subscribe to Icons and Legacies, where we explore not just fame, but what remains after it fades.